This is Dan DeMarco, and you are listening to Across the Board on the Compliance Podcast Network.
This is Mike Flanagan, and you're listening to Across the Board on the Compliance Podcast Network.
This is Greg Gilchrist, and you are listening to Across the Board on the Compliance Podcast Network.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 23 of Across the Board, a podcast that focuses on corporate governance, boards of directors, and management of strategic risk. Today, I have back with me podcast favorite Amii Barnard-Bahn. She is a strategic advisor to boards of directors and executive coach to many C-suite members. She specializes in accelerating the success of C-suite executives and partners with leaders and teams to help scale their businesses. She has shaped many company cultures and strategic initiatives as an executive at a Fortune 20 company, smaller businesses and nonprofits, and leading multiple functions including human resources, legal, IT, communications, and compliance. Today, we take a look at the ongoing turmoil at Tesla around its founder and CEO Elon Musk and his now infamous funding secure tweet from the corporate governance perspective. Some of the topics we discuss are: what should be the role of the board of directors at Tesla going forward? What type of board chair is needed to make the board truly independent? Why a compliance professional needs to be named to the Tesla board? How does either the board or the company get control of Elon Musk's personal Twitter account, particularly given his most recent tweet about the SEC? Do his other actions, including long-term lack of sleep, smoking marijuana during a public appearance, and calling the leader of the rescue of the Thai Boy Scouts a pedo, give rise to other concerns the board should address? And finally, should Musk have a seat on the board of directors going forward? This podcast will help you understand as a board member your role and your role going forward in this type of situation. Across the Board is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode. Today, I have back with me Amii Barnard-Bahn. Amii is a well-known corporate governance expert. She helps boards understand not only their roles in corporate governance, but also in compliance and risk management. So, Amii, with that introduction, welcome and thank you for taking the time to visit with me today.
Thanks, Tom. Happy to.
Amii, the theme of this podcast is something I've wanted to ask you for quite some time. So let me just put it out there. What are we going to do with Elon?
I think the world is wondering that. Yeah.
And when we last week when we discussed scheduling of this podcast, and we had an SEC action against him to strip him of the right to be an officer of a public company. Apparently, the settlement fell through at the last minute. I'm extraordinarily pleased to report that cooler heads prevailed, and the settlement was reached over the weekend. So at least we don't have that hanging over our heads, or perhaps more appropriately, the shareholders of Tesla having that hanging over their heads. But it really doesn't solve the problem that, or any of the answers to the potential answers to the questions I had. So there have been certain changes that the SEC settlement mandated at the board level. I certainly hope we can go about those. The role of Musk himself in the company. I know you have some pretty clear thoughts about his value to the company and how he really interacts with the company. So maybe I can start with the role of the board. What do you see the role of the board going forward, particularly in light of the SEC mandated changes?
Well, great question, Tom. I think that, just backing up, boards in general just need to be responsible for stewardship with the company and making sure that they're well situated to get the funding they need, to have good governance in place, to take exciting risks that make sense, and to avoid unrewarded risk. And we've seen a lot of that happening, unfortunately, at the hands of Elon here. And so that's going to be a part of I hate to say it, but kind of babysitting that they'll probably need to take a more active role in. There's been a lot going on for some time with Elon. There have been a lot of signs of burnout or of not managing impulses or poor judgment. But with the legal violations coming in, and the DOJ and SEC interactions, I think that's created the opportunity for the board to really step up. He has, I think it's 9 members on his board, and has been criticized in the past for not having a very independent board. His brother's on the board and some other close friends. It's 9 people on the board, himself being one of them and being the former chairman, now not, and then a 22% shareholder. So I think the role of the board going forward needs to be both around the financial risks of the company. They've settled the SEC, which, as you've said, is a great move, and that a lot of people who are even more expert than I am on this say that it was a pretty sweet deal in terms of what he got. And I think him stepping up quickly probably contributed to that, as opposed to being defensive. Or you and I have both seen how that works. If you cooperate and you were wrong, you tend to get a better deal if you step up, admit it, and move on more quickly. Now, they still have the DOJ case is still pending for criminal fraud. It'll be interesting to see whether they soften up after the SEC settlement. The bigger issue, though, for the board, too, is a true financial risk around the investor class lawsuits that are all coming their way. There are a lot of investors that lost big money in the market volatility following his Twitter statements. And as part of the settlement, both Musk and Tesla have to pay $20 million in fines, which is going to be used to mollify investors. But I know we expect the plaintiffs to push for even more funds. And for a guy with the net worth of Musk, which is last rated around $20 billion and the 46th richest person in the world, $20 million is like a parking ticket to potentially you and me, Tom.
So what about the board chair? One of the mandates is to have a new board chair come in, a truly independent board chair. Do you think they should reach for someone like a Warren Buffett, someone perhaps who's run a Fortune 500 company outside the auto space? Should they go internal? Or is there another calculus that you would put on the at least a search for a new chairman?
Yeah, great question. Boy, I wish they could get Warren Buffett. He and Elon would be a very powerful combination, I think, with Warren's judgment and down-to-earth sensibility and Elon's genius and innovation. That being said, I'm supposing that's not likely to happen. I think boards have to keep an interesting tension between healthy rapport and respect and the ability to get decisions made, not unlike, say, Congress. But they also need some tension so that the tough things can be said, so there's some honesty and there's a healthy challenge to decisions to really get the best of everyone in that. So they need to search for someone who's really well qualified that the other board members are going to trust and respect enough, but someone who's truly going to be independent, or as you and I know, there's really not going to be any change. With Elon being on the board and being CEO, there's going to be a tendency for them to bring in an insider where they have a comfy feeling about it, which then would mean things wouldn't really change. So they need to kind of walk the line in the middle, in my opinion, and try to find someone who will speak truth to power, but who will also try to get along and has tremendous influencing and gravitas. I think that the stock would improve significantly, because with every one of these erratic moves that Elon has made, the stock has dropped. And I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit later.
Right. The one thing I really advocate, Amii, is that there be not a compliance resource to the board, but compliance specialists on the board. And I really see this as a prime example. Something as basic as compliance would generally say, yes, we can do it legally, but we shouldn't do it. Or, yes, just because we can do it, should we do it? And they ask those types of questions. Would you also advocate a compliance specialist on the board?
Do you mean having a board seat, Tom, or being an advisor to the board that would attend or report to the board?
I mean, having a board seat, a compliance specialist.
I think it'd be amazing. I think it's something that my hope that there's a trend towards that, actually, because I think compliance professionals have a unique skill set. I've long been an advocate of including them more on boards because they have cross-functional expertise. they know the business really well, and they know how to get up to speed quickly. They know how decisions are made, and as you know, we always have to be influencers and kind of the conscience of the company. So that would be very helpful. And they have to appoint 2 new board members, I believe, as a part of the SEC settlement. So this would be an opportunity for them to do that. They're clearly lacking, any overarching ethical culture Sherpa, if you put it, which I think is what you're getting at. And I think it'd be extremely helpful. If they'd had that, if you run through all of the mishaps that have happened, you have to think that perhaps that would have helped. The only thing that's a bit of a challenge, I think, though, is Elon's personal style and this impulse control with Twitter specifically, which we've certainly seen with other leaders, and the fallout from that is the challenge. And so they have to have a little bit of a slow down to go fast mindset, I think. He and I don't know if it's the board really that's a problem. It seems to be really Musk, but they need a coach to give them pause to think and not give in to his impulses when he has some brilliant idea, like, taking the company private with the Saudis, or smoking some pot on a webcast. Not a great idea as CEO of a publicly traded company.
Let me see if I can break some of those down, because I think there's several different issues at play here. And let's start with a Twitter account. And now the tweet that we've been referencing here, where he talked about going private and had secured funding, was his personal Twitter account. It was not the corporate Twitter account that he controls. So one, the board has to get control of his personal Twitter account, and they have to or convince him that he has to have some sort of control over it. It's also the same Twitter account where he accused the lead rescuer of the Thailand Boy Scouts as being a pedophile, which is the subject now of a defamation lawsuit by the person he accused of that. And that, how would you advocate a board speak to a CEO directly about getting his Twitter account under control?
Yeah, well, they've been very clear. The SEC has said that they have to implement mandatory procedures and controls to oversee all of Elon Musk's communications regarding the company made in any format, period. So they happily, from a compliance standpoint, they've been very clear around what needs to happen. And if that doesn't happen, my guess is they'll go back to, if something else happens, they'll go back to their earlier threat that he was never going to be allowed to be the CEO of a publicly traded company or have a board seat. So the nice thing about that, I think, is there's some teeth in that, Tom. The original settlement, the original proposal or prosecution was threatening that, and so my hope is that Elon is paying attention to that and will understand that he needs to give up control on this. But in-house, I would think they need a compliance person and potentially a public relations person to review everything, and they literally probably should have control over his account. He could text what he would normally like to submit. They could quickly review it, put a process in place, and then when they approve it, they could post it for him. It's not uncommon for individuals of high profile or who are just super busy to give over their Twitter account to another professional to actually do the postings that are pre-vetted, pre-agreed upon by the individual. So it's still their voice, still their opinion, but clearly, as we've seen, when there are shareholders and stock prices and personal reputations at risk from someone who's clearly shown a lack of impulse control, it's important to have something like that. So that's what I would think they should do, is just gain an agreement, say, hey, we're going to be the shepherds of your account. If you have a tweet, send it to us. We'll review it. If there's nothing wrong with it, we'll just go ahead and publish it right away. If there's a concern, we're going to come back to you with our concerns, and let's chat about it.
Well, that brings me to the next topic, which is I think things that are perhaps a little different than impulse control. Nevertheless, I find, if not disturbing, perhaps troubling is a better word. And you mentioned one, which was allegedly smoking marijuana on publicly, I think, on a publicly produced podcast, but also, frankly, the lack of sleep. This has been the subject of a New York Times or in a New York Times article. It's been commented upon by other professionals. And we see a series of personal actions, which I would believe could be the first signs of someone on their way to even a breakdown. But it's certainly wildly deviating behavior than we see from many CEOs. Now, perhaps Musk does inhabit a very rarefied space that this is closer to normal for him. Now, you've worked in the Silicon Valley for multiple years, and you've seen some very successful people, some very highly intelligent people, some very driven people all come together. And I've certainly worked in those types of environments, but this kind of personal behavior, personal actions, do you see, one, that is any pause for concern? And then two, what does a board do about something like that?
Yeah, well, I think it was exceptional when Arianna Huffington sent a public, intervention letter to Elon Musk. We read that again the other day, and it was really a call for help for him, to have him please, respond. And of course, he reacted stoically, saying, you think I have a choice? I just got home from the factory. There is no choice. And Arianna Huffington has been a wonderful promoter of public health, given her own personal health crisis that came when she was burning herself out. And we've seen wonderful growth and expansion and gifts that she's had from changing her way of working hard. He is burning up. I just came from the Harvard Coaching Conference, and Richard Boyatzis, who's an expert in this area of burnout, especially it happens in healthcare and in other areas. And we literally, when we don't rest ourselves and don't regenerate and don't focus on things that are positive, we actually burn up our capacity for impulse control, for creativity. We call it burnout, but we really should call it burn up, because that's physically what happens. And he's creating legal risk. He's creating reputational risk for the company. And I think there's a warning of severe health issues. There's just so many things that he's done lately that are a problem. And so I think that is cause for fitness concerns, really. So I hope that the board gives him some coaching. I don't know how you force someone to do that. I think that's the tough part. You can't force someone to be healthy. It's interesting, I have seen some contracts, though. It comes up in the entertainment industry, which is another one of my clients. Sometimes if they have a star that is going off the rails, either with drug abuse, they will literally write a contract to that person and say, you need to do this, you need to go to this rehab, you need to stay sober, or we're canceling our contract with you. That's the biggest analogy I can think of right now, Tom, to this situation. I'm not suggesting that Elon's that far gone at all, but there definitely are signs. He also tweeted, I don't know if you remember, but he tweeted at one point that he had taken Ambien and drank some alcohol, and that really upset healthcare practitioners and doctors who advise strongly against that combination of alcohol and Ambien, which can be lethal. So there's just example after example with him. He also doesn't like being criticized. So this is another, there's the Thai rescue mission. The reason that he seemed to pop off and accuse the guy who was a part of the cave expert team in Thailand was that the guy criticized his mini-sub, and that's when he called him a pedophile. And then he also founded, after some, the press criticized Tesla for factory safety issues. And Elon reacted and created a website called Pravda, where users could rate the truthfulness of articles and journalists. And I don't know how you feel about using basically Yelp for news, but again, just another reactive tendency around not feeling attacked instead of just, being a big boy. If you lead, you're going to get criticized, and you need to see leadership as a privilege and as a responsibility, and you respond with information. You don't attack back. You need to lead, and that's another thing that concerns me very much about Elon's tendencies. He's 47. Hopefully he has a long runway, but he's still got a lot to learn.
Well, and that brings up another point I've wanted to visit with you on. We have touched upon this from time to time, and you have certainly seen this in your practice, where you have a truly exceptional founder, genius founder, people who can bend light rays, I think, is one of the descriptions of Steve Jobs. They're few and far between. Nevertheless, when they are in the right situation, they can create some really great things. But that is a very different skill than running literally a $350 billion valued corporation. And is it time, or not particularly to Elon Musk, but how does a board, I guess it can only be a board, move that kind of person to having a more fully creative role that they are probably better at, and less of a CEO and corporate governance where, frankly, the details are very, very important?
Yeah. Well, it's going to be an evolution, Tom. I think that it's challenging to find a role where you can harness the creativity. It's interesting what Mark Benioff has done recently. Of course, he, I think, has been an exceptional leader in many ways, and has not, and has navigated difficulties that Salesforce has, and he's created a co-chair. It'd be interesting to think about whether there is someone that Elon could partner with that could free him up to leverage all the amazing brain that he has. I mean, the guy has come up with 8 companies and growing. He has an AI company now that's dedicated to making sure that AI develops consistent with humanity and with ethical principles. He has a great fear of the future in that sense. So the good intention is there. If I were his coach, I would say, let's sit down, let's look at everything you're doing. What energizes you? Where's your main contribution? What do you really have to give to the world? Because it's considerable. And what's the other stuff that maybe you don't do so well? And let's get a partner and navigate this. And over the next year or so, find that sweet spot where he's alive and healthy. I mean, alive in terms of his creative genius, and he can leverage that for the good of society, the company, shareholders, his employees, and give up some of the stuff that's draining him, that he doesn't do so well. That would be ideal.
So let me end on this question. And I really don't think there's a right or wrong answer, but it gives us a way to explore kind of perhaps all of these themes we've talked about today, Amii. And this: should Elon Musk still retain a board seat on Tesla?
Yeah, well, from a practical standpoint, he owns 22%. And so most people who own 22% of a company insist on having a board seat, especially when they're the founder and CEO. I think you're asking should as opposed to will he. I think if there's another mishap, he may lose this. As we talked, the original SEC actions sought to bar Musk from becoming an officer or director or hold, any public CEO role, potentially for life. Now he's at least for now pushed that aside. So I think it's a wait and see. In terms of should, if they can have an independent chairperson and create healthy checks and balances, as we've been discussing on this podcast, then I think it could work okay. I think it really depends on how self-aware is Elon. Is he committed to the company's true success, or is his ego going to get the better of him? And is he going to fight to still retain control? How much can he give up here in order to gain so much more? He would gain so much more if he would give up some power right now and it would enable him, I bet he'd be surprised, it would enable him to just free up and focusing on that creative aspect. That's really the genius here.
Well, Amii, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time, but this has been a fascinating exploration of hopefully the conclusion of the SEC case against Elon Musk and where Tesla takes it from here. But I'm sure the story will continue to evolve, and I'm sure we'll continue to visit on this. So thank you for taking the time to visit with me today.
Absolutely. Always a pleasure, Tom.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Across the Board. If you have any questions about any of the topics we discussed, you can reach me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. You can reach Amii at Barnard-Bahn.com. That's AMII at BARNARDBAHN.com. I hope you will join us again for our next episode of Across the Board. Across the Board is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.